Hi everyone, today we are talking about the triggers. In this video, we will cover some key components for the triggers, like the definition of the hazard magnitudes, the analysis between hazard magnitude and impact. We will define and justify the impact level, and finally we will give an example of how to generate an intervention maps. Define hazard magnitudes. FBF provides funding for early actions for events of extreme and magnitude that have caused significant humanitarian impact in the past. It focuses on extreme events and not, for example, on annual floods that are better addressed by other interventions. One way of measuring of the magnitude of the event is the return period. What is a return period? It is the inverse of the probability, usually expressed in percent, and gives the estimated time interval between events of similar size or intensity. For example, the return period of a flood might be 100 years. In other words, this probability of occurrence is 1 in 100, or 1% in any given 1 year. This doesn't mean that if a flood occurs with this return period, the next flood will occur in about 100 years. But it means that in any given year, there is a 1% chance of it occurring, regardless of when the last similar event occurred. In this step, past hydrometeorological data must be collected and used to build a picture of the climate. This historical data is used to understand what is the normal for each location and what is unusual or extreme. This historical data can be used to calculate the return period of the most extreme events. In the figure shows the Iquitos city in the Peruvian Amazon and explain how different return periods 5, 10, 30, and 50 years can be associated to be flood level rise and it reach the city. Analyze links between hazard magnitude and impact. What impact can we expect from hazard of a certain magnitude? Not all events with return periods of 1 in 5 years will be extreme or have a significant humanitarian impact. Therefore, it is necessary to demonstrate what impact a given hazard is expected to have. Example, El Niño has a 7-year return period on average and causes severe impacts around the world. In this step, defines the relationship between the impact and the magnitude of the hazard, which will differ for communities with different vulnerabilities. For example, in the figure, you can see a small house adapted to recurrent floods with return periods between 1 and 3 years. But you can also see the marks caused by extreme floods that have return periods between 10 and 30 years. Impact curve. This step should provide decision makers with a view of what impact can be expected for which people or livestock assets to a given hazard magnitude. We normally call the impact hazard curve or vulnerability function. It establishes expected impact hazard magnitude and exposure. Ideally, this should be established for different sectors, impact types, and regions. For example, the impact of a cyclone with a certain wind speed will look much different in a refugee camp than in an urban town. We suggest three different approaches. Expert knowledge. This approach uses the expert judgment of people who work in the region and have an understanding of what kind of impact can be expected when the hazard strikes. Elementary modeling. This is a simple relationship that can be established. It's only a correlation with a couple indicators. For example, the Peruvian Red Cross used a people affected historical impact and water discharge in a major river basin in the Amazon. In the figure, for example, when there are seasonal floods and wet floods, category 1 and 2 in the figure, the impact is quite low. However, when there are severe floods, such as in 2012 and 2015, the impact related to the affected population increased dramatically. Statistical modeling. Another more complex approach may be the use of machine learning, which is an algorithm that can learn from historical data without relying on rule-based programming. This type of statistical modeling is the quantitative representation of the relationship between variables in the form of mathematical equations. Define and justify your impact level. Following the previous steps, we must determine the level of impact and the corresponding hazard magnitude at which your early action protocol should be triggered. In the early action protocol, you must explain how the impact level has been defined and provide information to demonstrate that the magnitude of the event corresponds to the impact level selected and has caused humanitarian impact in the past. In the figure is an example of how the Peruvian Red Cross determined their impact levels based on historical impact data with the local partners. In the figure, when the river level reached 118.5, it corresponds to a 10-year return period, and this level triggers the early action protocol in Peru. Generate intervention maps. Where and when should decision makers take early actions? Historically, vulnerability and exposure maps have been used primarily for planning and infrastructure, but not necessarily to contextualize forecasts and warnings. When an impact level is reached, we combine vulnerability and exposure information with real-time forecasting to identify which areas are likely to be most affected. How make it? There are two main ways of doing this. First, the most advanced way will be to digitally combine the forecast with the vulnerability and exposure maps to predict the expected impact. By overlaying the maps, it will become clear which areas are expected to be most affected. These areas can then be selected as a priority areas for early action to ensure that the most risk community receive assistance before the events occur. These few options will provide a map-based tool or list of priority towns, municipalities, or other geographical areas where the early action will be triggered. When risk information management platforms are available, it can be a way to develop impact forecast intervention maps. However, in a second approach, you have more simple form. Vulnerability and exposure information can be combined with forecasts using expert judgment to identify the most risk locations. Where a digital system is not available, this could be done manually. For instance, if flooding is forecast in a given area, the vulnerable community in the floodplain could be selected. Thank you for your attention and good luck to identify your set the trigger for your early action protocol.